When I first heard the words, "Once upon a time," I thought they were the most beautiful words I'd ever heard. Magic in some way, possibly religious. "Tell me a story," I would say, and a story would be told. Once upon a time there was. And then I heard, "In the high and far off times, O best beloved," and I knew that stories could be told in many ways. Later, I learned to make up my own stories, and eventually I learned to write the story of my own life by using a journal. And after that, there was nowhere else to go, nothing else to do than to become a professional storyteller, a preacher. Good morning and welcome to First Jefferson Unitarian Universalist Church. My name is Annie Foerster, and I minister to this congregation in Fort Worth, Texas, a congregation of storytellers and story listeners. And this morning, I'm going to tell you the story of stories. Some stories are told in words, and others in melody. Let us begin our worship this morning with the latter. Misha? That was our musical storyteller, Misha Boresnev. Our call to worship this morning was written by the Reverend Scott Taylor. And he said, "We gather as a house of stories. As we learn of those who have gone before, the way in front of us becomes more clear. As we weave together the tales of who we are, our loneliness lessens, and the web of our oneness is revealed. As we listen deeply in those times of tender trust, we descend into the longings and learnings, hopes and fears of the humanity we share. Beneath the wells from which we drink, there is a deeper well that feeds them all. Come, let us tell each other tales of our thirst. Let us drink from the stories that sustain us all. But first let us sing. We sing of golden mornings. It's number 44 in our hymn book, and our song leader this morning is David Bindi.
We sing of golden mornings, we sing of sparkling seas, of prairies, valleys, mountains, and stately forest trees. We sing of flashing sunshine and life beneath the stain, of birds among the branches, and springtime comes again. We sing the heart courageous, the youthful eager mind. We sing of hope undaunted, of friendly ways and kind. We sing the roses waiting beneath the deep piled snows. We sing the earth's great splendor, whose beauty round us glows.
Our chalice lighting this morning was written by the Reverend David Breeden. We tender this flame, opening the book, turning the page yet to be written, opening a story yet to be told. May we fill this fresh page wisely. May we write a new story into being. May we together inscribe the page with hope. Please join me in saying our covenant, the words of which will be on your screen. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is our sacrament, and service is our prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve others in community, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with creation, thus do we covenant with one another. I have lots of questions this morning to start the service. What's your favorite story? Is it a story of love, of bravery, of beauty? Or perhaps it's a story of betrayal or fear or loneliness? Or something else that speaks to just you? And what did that story teach you? How did it make you strong? Is there yet an ending? Is it your own story or one you share with someone else, or perhaps the story of a stranger? But before we begin to answer these questions, we have a story for all ages. Thomas Earthman, our religious education staff, is in the building this morning. And Thomas, would you help me tell the story this morning? And let's sit where we tell the story when we're together with other people. Thank you for joining me. This story was first told by the Reverend Christopher Bice, and he called it The Beautiful Tiger.
There once was a beautiful and powerful tiger. One day, she was captured by a cruel man who kept her, who crept up behind her while she was resting. He put her into a cage, which he kept in the jungle not far from his house. Every day he would bring out a bowl of water and some food for the lonely, angry tiger. Sometimes the tiger would see her own reflection in the bowl of water, and she would say, "My, I'm a beautiful tiger."
But when the man heard her say this, he would lie to her and he'd tell her, "No, you're not a beautiful tiger. You're very ugly. You're a pitiful creature."
Sadly, in spite of what she saw in the water bowl, the tiger began to believe the man. Some days, after she ate her food, she would walk back and forth in her cage to feel the energy and power moving through her body, and she would say, "My, I am a powerful tiger."
And when the man heard her say this, he would lie again and tell her, "No, you are weak and puny. You're in a cage. You're a pitiful creature."
Sadly, the tiger began to believe the man.
Then one day when the man was nowhere around, a lion happened to walk by the tiger's cage. And the lion saw the tiger inside and spoke to her, "Beautiful and powerful tiger, what are you doing lying about in that cage?"
"Do not make fun of me," replied the tiger. "I know that I'm neither powerful nor beautiful."
"Oh, I'm not making fun of you," said the lion. "You are surely the most beautiful and powerful tiger that I've ever seen. I'm only surprised to see you lying there when you are clearly strong enough to simply leave that cage."
"You really think I could break out of here?" asked the tiger.
"Quite easily, I should think," replied the lion.
The tiger was not so sure at first. She had been told so many times that she was a weak and pitiful creature, it was hard to believe the lion's praise. But suddenly, it seemed that she could feel a familiar energy and a strength moving through her body. She remembered the beautiful tiger she used to see reflected in her water bowl, and the tiger began to pace back and forth in her cage. And then, almost without a thought, she leapt against the cage door which gave way to her power and flew open without any resistance. Once outside, she seemed dazed. "That cage didn't even have a lock on it," she said. "I spent so much of my life stuck in there, and the door wasn't even locked. What was I thinking?"
Well, the lion looked at her with soft brown eyes and said, "Those kinds of cages don't need locks. Someone lied to you, and it's the lies we believe that keep us in our cages. Fortunately, it's the truth we believe that will set us free." You know, I've always wanted to visit Australia. I've read a lot about it, and I've read stories that begin there, but I've never gone. Someday, perhaps. I read something, though, recently that made me revisit this wish, something different for what I'm used to about the way a stranger is greeted. You know, how when you meet someone here, wherever here is for you, but in this country, in the United States, there are a series of stock questions like, "What do you do?" As if you are your job. Or, "Where are you from?" As if you might be a stranger from a strange land. Or then there's the role questions. "Are you married? Do you have children?" Or if I assume you don't look like you would have interesting answers to these other questions, I can simply say, "How are you?" But in Australia, I've heard, the greeting goes like this: "Happy to meet you. What's your story?" What's your story? What's your story? The implication as I read it, you can choose what story to tell, the story that best represents you, the story of the person you want to be today, or the story of how your life is unfolding at this very moment. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we were all that open to hearing one another's stories? I mean, what story would you tell? Would it be the same one you told yesterday? This is really, really important. Please give it some thought. Is the story you tell when asked who you are one that you discovered, that you wrote for yourself? Or is it the story, like the caged tigers, that was told to you by someone else? I mean, this happens. I'm old enough to remember that at one time there was a person in every newspaper staff whose job it was to see that women didn't get away with telling their own stories. You see, I was the publicity secretary for an organization that was affiliated with another organization to which my husband belonged, his being the main organization, with mine being the auxiliary. After every meeting, I would write up what took place, who did what, and send it to the local newspaper who said they were interested in such news. And I would write something like this: Mary Smith was elected president of the organization for the coming year, and Jenny Jones gave a talk on the importance of communicating with political representatives. And then the newspaper staff person would edit my copy until it read, "Mrs. John Smith has a new role in the organization, and Mrs. James Jones gave a little talk. This group is the auxiliary to the XYZ organization for men to which their husbands belong." That's a true story. Every month I argued with the editor of the newspaper, and every month I lost. It's style policy, I would be told. Women's stories aren't important, he was really telling me. But enough of us around the country argued and kept on arguing until we were eventually allowed to tell our own stories. The style changed. So I ask again, what is your story? This coin, these stories I'm telling you about, has two good sides, not a head and a tail, but two heads. Because once you can choose and tell your own story, you understand how important it is to ask for the story of everyone you meet. Because if you don't, you're going to miss some very compelling people. Well, I remember years ago being introduced to a neighbor I assumed wouldn't have a story that interested me. I mean, I could just tell by looking at her, right? My children were in high school, while hers were just starting grade school. I worked, and she stayed home and kept house for her husband. Her clothes spoke of mine, of money, and mine of being pieced from a pattern in my spare time. I was from around here, and she was from out of town. I probably said to her, "Hello, how are you?" And she said, "Fine, how are you?" And we went our separate ways. Only we didn't. We kept showing up at the same meetings, the same musical programs, the same volunteer organizations. It turned out we had a lot in common among our differences. And finally, we began to share stories, hesitantly at first, and then with more interest and more urgency. We also had some stories that were very different from one another's, which kind of gave our relationship depth and breadth. We eventually became friends, good friends, because we knew each other's story. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, Joan Didion wrote in the White Album. It's the way our brains work, she said. It's the way we evolved. Once told, first to ourselves and then to others, stories give structure and meaning to our lives. Stories help us organize our experiences while giving us a sense of self with a big S. Told often enough, they dictate how we will behave next, so as to keep the story intact. But our stories aren't immutable. We are constantly adding to the story from new experiences, updating it to keep it factual. Some psychologists actually believe that our stories are what constitutes our very personalities. We check our stories before we act, respond, or set out on a new venture. Consistency is important to the story we tell ourselves. That might be why so many people are resistant to change. Too much alteration in one's life might lead to rewriting the story, and that predicts chaos to the settled mind. And yet, as we mature, we do often change the focus of our stories. Seeing our lives at 12 or 16, say, gives us a different picture from what we see when we look back at 30 or 50 through a fog of more mature experiences. And our life stories aren't created in a vacuum either. We pick up on cultural cues and narratives, like the classically American rags to riches story. And these deeply inform the stories that we tell to ourselves. Cultural themes and mythologies are used and appropriated, and we find ways to fit them into our own narratives so that we feel that we belong. Thus, the story we choose to tell at any given moment with any particular audience in any unique situation is colored by all of these influences, as well as the stories we have listened to while we gathered our thoughts to speak our own. It's a fascinating topic. Come, tell me your story, and I'll tell you mine. Oh, better yet, come sing a song with me. Our song leader, again, David Bindi, will help us sing Come Sing a Song with Me, number 346 in the Gray Hymnal.
Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me, that I might know your mind. And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the winter time. Come dream a dream with me. Come dream a dream with me. Come dream a dream with me, that I might know your mind. And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. and I'll bring a song of hope and a love in the winter time. Come walk in rain with me. Come walk in rain with me. Come walk in rain with me, that I might know your mind. And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the winter time. Come share a rose with me. Come share a rose with me. Come share a rose with me, that I might know your mind. And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the winter time.
That was lovely. I have a generosity report for you this week. 2 weeks ago, we voted on a new budget. Our stewardship campaign was a success, with pledges totaling more than last year's, even during this close down. Thanks to everyone who participated, and to Dan Sexton, this year's campaign chair, and to Roy Brake and Dan, who put together the budget we approved. This is just the beginning to our new and successful church year. More news on that next week. I have 2 readings this morning. The first one comes from the Book of Awakening by Mark Nepo. And he wrote, "We all face a turning point when resisting the flow of inner events suddenly feels more hurtful than leaping toward the unknown. Yet no one can tell us when to leap. There is no authority to bless our need to enter life but the God within. Often we thwart ourselves by holding tenaciously to what is familiar. It is instructive, if chilling, that in floral shops that roses that will not open are called bullets. They are discarded because they will never bloom. They have turned in on themselves so tightly that they can never release their fragrance. Yet, as spirits in bodily form, we have the chance to tighten and bloom more than once in our lives. But even spirits, if turned in on themselves enough, may grow accustomed to being closed. Unlike roses, however, the human chamber can be shut down for years, and still it takes but one breath from the true center, and we will follow." My second reading is from The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, who wrote, "Stories are for joining the past to the future. Stories are for those late hours in the night when you can't remember how you got from where you were to where you are. But stories are for eternity, when memory is erased, when there is nothing to remember except the story." I like that. But you know, stories come in all shapes and sizes. I mean, there are biographies and there are novels. There are features and novellas, articles and short stories, paragraphs and sentences. There are resumes and application essays, medical histories and genealogies, memories and dreams. Sometimes your story is large by necessity or rendered small by fear. Sometimes it is all facts, and sometimes mere conjecture. I came across an interesting concept about story on YouTube that I'd like to share with you. If you want to hear the whole rendition yourself, you can find it by searching for Daniel Pink, The One Sentence Project. I bet you could find it if you forget his name. The One Sentence Project would be all it takes. But he tells the story of Claire Booth Luce, one of the first women in Congress, who approached John Kennedy one day and boldly said, "Mr. President, You don't understand the basic structure of leadership. All great leaders have a single sentence, she said. He must have been shocked, but intrigued, he asked her what she meant, and she said, look, Abraham Lincoln had a single sentence. He saved the Union and he freed the slaves. FDR had a single sentence. He lifted us out of the Great Depression and he saw us through the war. You have at best a muddled paragraph. Nobody understands what you're trying to do. Go get yourself a sentence. Well, after Pink told this story, the One Sentence Project caught on in schools. And you can also see videos on YouTube of youth and adolescents telling their sentence, who they are and what they plan to do with their lives in one sentence. Well, if you're like me, it will bring tears to your eyes and a smile to your heart. But leaders need a sentence. As she said, journalists need a soundbite. But most of us utilize interactive chapters, stories that are structured around a common timeline and theme, but have different uses for, say, social interaction, selling yourself as a commodity, apologizing and repenting, promising and predicting, and most importantly, for reminding yourself that you are special. Narrative psychology, and yes, there is a psychological discipline about writing and telling one's own story. Narrative psychology claims we can alter our own stories and rewrite our own scripts in ways that improve our ongoing lives. Allow me to give you some example. Here's one hopeful note for those of you who feel the pressure of time. When you're younger, there's more room in your story for drama, conflict, and negativity. But as people reach middle age and later in life, which often corresponds with increasing levels of happiness and well-being, according to most psychologists, these parts of the story fade into the background. And as a general trend in aging, your story becomes more positively skewed over time. Hey, another benefit to hanging in there. Narrative psychologist Dan McAdams, who has written several books on the topic of personal stories and their importance in our lives, says we can take control of our own stories. We can examine them and make sure they are written out of our own experience and not colored by stories we were told by someone else, like the beautiful tiger story. Although these stories are largely determined by our cultures and personalities, writes McAdams, we do have a degree of control over what we tell ourselves about our own lives. Even if we take themes from our society, we are the ones putting them together, and we have some conscious sense of doing so. There are things we can all do, according to McAdams, to make our stories better, because making our stories better makes our lives better. And one of them is to think positively. Now, perhaps you're an optimist or perhaps you're a pessimist, he says, but you might want to try the approach of realistic optimism, a kind of combination, seeking a a truthful view of events with a modicum of hope. He said, I think people need to interrogate themselves with respect to their life stories. What am I trying to do here? What's the long-term gain? And how am I going to leave the world a better place when I'm through? Well, so far we have two assignments from today's lessons. First, what is your sentence? Not as easy as it sounds, but kind of fun. I tried it. I'll tell you mine if you tell me yours. And second, do some editing of your own story where it's needed. Be aware of your story and how powerful it can be, both on others and on yourself. But don't start just yet. I have one more response that says stories is not just a social construct. It's a religious one, a spiritual one, a covenanting one. Stay tuned. Every Sunday we take time for a communion of names and milestones, the stories that live in this community. And I'm really excited to tell you a new member signed the book this week. Her name is Adrienne Clay, and she's been listening online and likes what she hears so far. She may be dropping into a meeting near you, so look for her and welcome her here. Ask her what her story is. Adrienne is interested in libraries, especially church libraries, and she wants to know if she could look at ours and suggest some improvements, make borrowing easier perhaps, creating an online database. 4 days a member, and she's already volunteering. Welcome, Adrienne. What's your story? And I couldn't help but stop here without mentioning the terrible war that's going on over in Israel. I know we can't take sides, I know we can't fix it, but I think we need to consider what's going on there and the pain and suffering that's going on as well. As we take some time to share a meditation, a moment of quiet, to consider the stories of our lives and those whose lives interact with ours. And then we'll have a musical meditation before I go into my third response. Please share the quiet with me for a moment. Thank you, Misha. Well, here's the main plot to this story I've been telling you, and you may have guessed my intent already. Stories are important not just to the lives of individuals, but to communities as well. You see, communities have histories, communities have dreams, but holding it all together are the stories that members of the community tell to themselves and to one another. I once visited a church as a guest speaker, and after the service, one of its members began to tell me a story. She said, "We're in the search process for a new minister," she said, but she didn't look happy. So I asked her what was going on, and she said, "You know, I don't hold out much hope. We have a wonderful interim minister. We would love to keep her, but it's not allowed." And then she said, "We always have good interim ministers, but what's available for calling is never as good." And without thinking, because it was none of my business really, I said to her, "Look, if that's the story you believe, it will always be so." They were just at the beginning of the selection process, and being the minister of the church just down the street for them, I was eventually asked to come to speak to their search committee. And I related to the group that conversation I had with the member of the church, keeping her identity a secret, of course. And I asked how many of them felt the same way. Most of them. And I repeated my warning, if that's the story you believe, it will always be so, because we all act out of the stories we tell. I'd like to think that I was responsible for their successful search, but I have to admit it might have just been a coincidence. But they did choose an excellent minister for themselves. She ended up staying for 18 years, helping them grow, expanding their service to the community, creating an excellent children's education program, and helping them come to believe in themselves. But the first 2 years of her calling were made difficult by those who still believed she was not good enough, or she would not stay because she wasn't the interim. But she persevered, and she helped them change their story. Human beings have this ability to engage in episodic memory. They can recall scenarios from their past that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Little stories. Narrative psychologist Dan McAdams calls them the ability to do that also enables them to see the future. You as an individual can imagine your future as little stories that haven't happened yet. Well, the same is true of communities. What are the stories that you tell about First Jefferson Unitarian Universalist Church, the ones you believe at this very moment? Well, here's some of the narratives I've heard. We were the first Unitarian church in Fort Worth, the one that's been here the longest. That's a story of pride. Some people broke away and started their own church. That's a story of concern, because it could happen again. But then the two churches got back together again, which is why we have two names. And this is true. The other church in town is made up entirely of atheists. That's one crazy story I heard, and it's not completely true from my experience. Perhaps we could edit that to say, these two churches have different religious personalities. And that would cover it all. There are stories about past ministers told here, stories about building, stories about glory days, stories about people now gone who have given their names to rooms or simply made a place in your hearts. And these stories are important too, but they are not inflexible. Remember what McAdams said. By understanding how we create these stories and how they are structured, we can alter our own stories and rewrite our own scripts in ways that improve our lives. So as a community, we need to ask questions of our stories, both the individual ones and the ones that live among us. Questions like, who am I? Where am I going? Where do I come from? What do I need? What do I want? Two very different questions. These questions play a large role in motivating the development of an integrated life story, says McAdams. And they mean nothing to the community unless we tell them to each other and then listen for any agreement or none. Our story gets increasingly complicated as we go through life. You bring in new characters, new themes, and unexpected drama. Negative events loom large, and there is fear of repeating them. Positive events are considered in this light as flukes we cannot count on to happen again. But there's always hope. One of the most exciting discoveries in the study of narrative psychology is that successful people's stories contain themes of redemption. That is, when the story starts out badly, when it has negative events, disruptions, deceit, or loss, the story can be transitioned into some positive outcome. For instance, says McAdams, a negative story might be about getting fired or divorced, but a generative script retells it as an opportunity to try something new, to come out of it better than you were before. And here's the best part about stories. You can begin a new narrative before it comes to pass. You can begin a story of what you hope might happen. No, what you believe could happen. You can name the tiger in the cage and break open the door that isn't locked. You can generate a new story out of the courage it took to see the redeeming possibilities in a negative event. So, what are the stories you are ready to tell about our future based on our history? We used to have a large youth program, but we don't have that anymore. That's one story. How about, we used to have a large youth program, and we need to start planning to build another one because it is part of our strength, and there are some youth still around in this church. Or here's one. We'll never grow because we don't have a social justice program. But it could be told like this: let's start planning a social justice program as we prepare to grow. An identity as a caring organization ought to attract new members. We've been locked down because of COVID-19, and we've lost our momentum to grow. That's a story I've heard over the past 14 months. But this is how I've been telling it. We've been locked down because of COVID-19, but in spite of our not being together, we've had a successful stewardship campaign this year, and we need to start planning how we will come together again and what we will do to celebrate our thriving community. So many stories, so many possibilities. Once upon a time, I have a dream. I am beautiful and powerful, whether you think I am or not. Oh, people, what's your story? I want to know you. What's your story? I want you to know yourself. What's your story? Anything is possible. No, everything is possible. And that takes us to our closing hymn. It's number 1019 in the Teal hymnal.
Everything is one more story to tell. It's a story about lullabies. Lullabies aren't just songs that we sing to children to put them to sleep. Lullabies can be songs that inspire love, hope, courage, and faith. That everyone can be anything and everything possible. We've cleared off the table, the leftovers saved, washed the dishes and put them away. I've told you a story and tucked you in tight at the end of your knockabout day. As the moon sets its sail to carry you to sleep over the midnight sea, I will sing you a song someone sang once to me. May it keep you good company. Oh, you can be anybody you want to be. You can love whomever you will. You can travel any country where your heart leads, and know that I will love you still. You can live by yourself, or you can gather friends around. You can choose one special one. And the only measure of your words and your deeds will be the love you leave behind when you're done. There are girls who grow up strong and bold. There are boys quiet and kind. Some race on ahead, some follow behind. We all grow in our own way and time. Some women love women and men love men. Some like children and some never do. You can dream all the day, never reaching the end of impossible for you. Don't be rattled by taunts and tints and games, but speak out spirits true. If you give your best, the best part of yourself, they'll give the same back to you. Oh, you can be anybody you want to be. You can love whomever you will. You can travel any country where your heart leads, and know that I will love you still. You can live by yourself, or you can gather friends around. You can choose one special one. But the only measure of your words and your deeds will be the love you leave behind when you're gone. Will be the love you leave behind when you're gone.
Thank you, David and Misha. That was like having two sermons this morning. This chalice was lit to tell a new story, to build on the living story, one that begins with the new day, the new dream, the new hope. Let us keep the pride we have in our history of daring and doing as we begin to tell the story of our dreaming and our daring. Let us hold this light in our hearts as we extinguish it here this morning. You are the story of the world. You are the world coming to know itself. May you trust that all you will ever say or do belongs as part of the story of the world. So may it be in all our lives.